So, this is part one, and what we're going to cover today is what's called the dating of the authorship of the book of Revelation. Now, what is that? Now, as everybody has come to know with my writing style, I take things that are complex, and I try to make them very simple for people to understand. So in this case, the concept is this: when was the book of Revelation written? That's an important question, because let's say that we were both to look at a giant painting of a war scene, and we were to try to decide what war we're looking at. If the painting was painted in the 1800s, then it could be about any war before the 1800s, but it couldn't be about World War I or World War II or Vietnam, because those hadn't happened yet. So when we look at the book of Revelation, it's important to know when was this book written if it's a prophecy about events that are about to take place. They can't be written after the events have taken place if they're about events that are about to take place. Also, the book is written about events that are shortly to take place. They're going to happen very soon. In place if they're about events that are about to take place. Also, the book is written about events that are shortly to take place. They're going to happen very soon. So, what happened very soon after the book was written? So, the premise that I come from is called the early date, that the book of Revelation was written at an earlier date. And there are others who are believers in the book of Revelation being written at a later date. The later date teaches that the book of Revelation was written in 96 AD, under the reign of King Domitian. The early date believes that the book of Revelation was written under Caesar Nero, which would mean that it was written in about the early 60s AD. There's a big difference between those two dates. To say that the book of Revelation was written in 96 AD means that John was somewhere near 100 years old when he wrote the book of Revelation. It also is the very popular view in the Western world right now. Most American Christians and Western European Christians have been taught that the book of Revelation was written in 96 AD. I have here on the board behind me 7 major proofs that I believe point to the book of Revelation being written at the earlier date in the reign of Nero in the early 60s AD. That being said, if it can be proven that it was written before that earlier date, then it could actually be a prophecy about the events of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which I believe is actually very possible. So I'm just going to go through these. In my book, I have more than these, but these are some of the core ones, the ones that I find easiest to communicate. And number one we have here at the top, number one, the Syriac Pesheto. What is the Syriac Pesheto? As we know, the Bible that we have nowadays, about 2,000 years later after the canon was closed in 325, but the Bible was finished being written in the 1st century, that the Bible we have now in our English translation has been passed down through other translations. It's gone through Latin, it's gone through Greek, Hebrew, to finally arrive in our hands in English. But one of the original versions, actually the earliest manuscript, literally the earliest manuscript, is called the Syriac Pesheto version. The Syriac Pesheto was actually from the 2nd century. It is the earliest manuscript we have of the Bible. What's fascinating is right at the beginning of the Syriac Pesheto version, there is an introduction. It says, the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ by the Apostle John. And then it has an introduction. And here's what the introduction says. It says, again, the revelation which was upon the holy John, the evangelist from God, when he was on the island of Patmos, where he was thrown by the Emperor Nero. That one by itself, I find the most convincing. I could just leave it at just the one, and I would be completely convinced. The earliest version of the Bible that we even have tells us it was written while John was in exile on the island of Patmos, sent there by the Emperor Nero. That's pretty convincing. That alone is one argument, but we're going to go through the other 6, and there's more inside the book if you'd like to see. The second one is Revelation chapter 17, verse 10. In Revelation chapter 17, verse 10, it says this: "There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while." If we were to consider that John wrote this, like the Syriac Peshetto says, like the scripture says, the earliest version, that he wrote it during the reign of Nero, then Revelation 17 verse 10 actually makes sense. That there are 5 kings who've come, 1 that now is and 1 that will come. So the first 5 that came were Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. Those are the first 5 rulers of Rome. The one that now is, as John is writing the book of Revelation, would be Nero. That's the 6th king. The 7th king is Galba. And it says he must remain for a short while, or he'll only be king for a short while. Well, what's that mean? Galba actually was king. He was Caesar for only 6 months in Rome. So it fits actually quite beautifully when we see this picture. Otherwise, how do we know when to start the 7 kings? Which one's the 6th king? Which one's the 7th king? We have no time indicator for when the 7 kings start, other than the fact that John is writing during the reign of the 6th king, saying 1 now is, and the next one will be king only for a short while. That actually makes sense. The third one is that those that pierced him. This is from Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. It says this: "Lo, he doth come with the clouds." This is from the Young's literal translation. "Lo, he doth come with the clouds, and see him shall every eye, even those who did pierce him, and wail because of him shall all the tribes of the land." Now, although it sounds kind of like King James and it can sound a little more complicated, the Young's literal translation is very straightforward. It's much more accurate than some of the others. And so it doesn't try to smooth out into the English. It just takes the Greek language and translates it over into the English. And it can seem a little choppy sometimes because of that. But what we have here is he's saying that those that pierced him, they will see him when he comes. Now, this is not talking about Jesus' second coming. This is talking about his coming in destruction. He's coming to bring the wrath and the outpouring, the vengeance, all of that. And it says here, every eye shall see him, even those that did pierce him. How does that work if we have 2,000 years go by before these events take place? How will those people who died 2,000 years ago, who were actually the Roman soldiers that pierced him, how will those eyes see him when he returns? That just doesn't fit. But it actually does fit if this prophecy is written about events that are going to take place about 10 years after John is prophesying it in the early 60s, about 70 AD, it actually starts to make sense. Because he's saying the eyes that actually pierced Jesus, those eyes that were the soldiers that pierced him, they will still be here and they will actually see him. Now, some of our other translations of Revelation 1:7 say that all the eyes of the world, or the whole world, will see him. That's actually not what it says. It doesn't use the Greek word cosmos to say the whole world. It actually uses a localized word, which is ukimene, which means a localized, or all the people, or as Young says, all the tribes of the land, which makes it a localized destruction, not a worldwide destruction. Number 4, the Jewish persecution in Revelation chapter 6 and chapter 11. See, before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, there were all the Jewish leaders coming against the early church. And so during that time period, there's tremendous persecution going on, which is actually written about in Revelation chapter 6 and chapter 11. But after AD 70, that wouldn't have been possible because there were 1.1 million Jewish people inside of Jerusalem that are put to death, as well as temple destruction, as well as 8,500 priests. At the same time, the early church has fled Jerusalem, and they're living on Mount Pella nearby in complete safety. So from the time of the destruction in 70 AD, from that time forward, it's not been possible at any time for the Jewish people to be the ones that are persecuting the church any longer. That was a limited time, only between 30 and 70 AD, that the early church was persecuted by the Jewish synagogue. So we have the Jewish persecution of the early church. Number 5, there's no mention of Jerusalem's destruction. Now that's fascinating because you might be saying, well, Jonathan, aren't you saying that 70 AD is the reason that the book of Revelation was written and it's about Jerusalem's destruction? Yes, that is what I'm saying. But notice, if the book of Revelation was written in 96 AD, that would only be 26 years after the destruction of 70 AD. What's fascinating is that you can go through 22 whole chapters of the book of Revelation, and not once does it ever refer back to the destruction that would have supposedly taken place only 26 years earlier. The destruction of the temple, the destruction of the city, the destruction of the priesthood, the genealogical records being burned and destroyed in the city, all of that is not even mentioned once in the entire book of Revelation because it hadn't happened yet. That's why we know it was written beforehand. See, in Revelation chapter 11, it talks about the temple standing in Jerusalem and that John is to go and measure the temple in Jerusalem. So 1, the temple's still standing. And 2, when they're writing this, if it was written after the destruction of the temple, there would have been some mention of it. It's like if I told you to go measure the Twin Towers. Well, there are no Twin Towers. Why wouldn't I at least mention, well, I mean in a vision because we know the Twin Towers are no longer still standing. It doesn't even make sense that there's no mention of Jerusalem's destruction in the sense of it has already happened, because it hadn't happened yet. That most traumatic, incredible event had not happened yet. Number 6, this one I find fascinating. Jerome actually wrote about John the Apostle, his appearance, his physical appearance, when he showed up to speak in 96 AD. Let me read to you what Jerome wrote. He said that John was with difficulty carried to the church. He was physically carried to the church, and he could speak only a few words to the people. Now this is the same John that in Revelation chapter 10, verse 11, it says that John must prophesy again concerning many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. It's very difficult to imagine that John is going to be able to speak to nations and kings if in 96 AD, when he writes this book, he's also has to be carried around and he's feeble and can barely speak a few words because he's so old. That's just hard to believe. And our 7th point, and as I said in the book, I cover a lot more points, but in the 7th point that we'll share is the timetable comparison with Daniel. See, in the book of Daniel, it ends in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. It says this: "Seal up the vision, for it is a long way off." Now, the events of Daniel is speaking about only 500 years later when Jesus comes. He's the rock that crashes into the statue. That's only 500 years later. And in Daniel, it says, seal up the vision. It's a long way off. But the end of Revelation, chapter 22, verse 10, it says, John is told, do not seal up the vision because it concerns things which must shortly come to pass. So Daniel's prophecy is about events that are 500 years away, and they're called a long way off, and he's to seal up the vision. John's prophecy is about events that are shortly to come to pass, and he's told not to seal up the vision. And yet, for those who believe that the book of Revelation was written in 96 AD about events that are in our future, they're saying that a short way off, and not to seal up the vision, is actually more than 2,000 years. That's 4 times as long as the prophecies of Daniel coming to pass, which were called a long way off. So I hope this has been helpful. It's just the very beginning. It's part 1, and we're going to come back with some other parts in this series to address some more issues. But all of this is being covered in the 2nd edition of Raptureless, as well as the Art of Revelation, which is available right now on Kindle. You can go download it and start reading immediately, or this Christmas 2013 we'll have it available in paperback with small group study guides. And we'd love to see churches and home groups just take this and rethink the book of Revelation in a way that you may have never considered. Thank you so much for taking the time today. Bless you.